Tonight, we are going to be examining the 13 principles. Until now, we had two classes, which I would call more of the introductory nature. The first class, we explained the concept that if you don't believe in the 13 principles of faith, then you have no share in the world to come. That is what Maimonides teaches us. And we explained in the first class that it's not that you can't be a good person without believing in the 13 principles of faith, but we explained that it's a cause and effect. The world to come is the relationship with God. If you don't develop the relationship with God in this world, you can't have the relationship with God in the world to come. It's just, it's causality. That's all it is. Of course, what your level in the world to come will be, even if you believe in the 13 principles of faith, dependent on how you live your life based on those 13 principles of faith. But the reason why, if you don't believe in the 13 principles of faith, you don't have a place in the world to come, is because to build a proper relationship with God, it's dependent on these 13 principles. If you develop a relationship with God, but you're missing some of these 13 principles, it's a misguided relationship, or it's a relationship which doesn't hit the mark in a way which is proper, and therefore it doesn't develop the relationship for the world to come. So this is super, super important. So that was class number one. Class number two, we dealt with the question of how do we know that there is a God? We want to sort of turn this discussion from beliefs into more in the realm of knowledge. We want to know that there is a God, like Maimonides writes in the Yad HaChazaka. It's a mitzvah leida. It's a mitzvah to know that there is a God, and we tried to do that last week, where we delved into many of the scientific elements, and we talked about, even though we know, there's still an element of faith, because since it's proof through exclusion, not proof through deduction, there's always going to be the ability to deny God if you so choose, and therefore to live a holy life, to live a life where we are faithful, living faithfully according to that knowledge, we have to take a small leap. We'll call it a little froggy hop over that little line that is caused because of the fact that it's proof through exclusion. Tonight we're going to actually get into the meat and potatoes, the cholent and the kishka, the gefilte and the chrein. Okay, we're going to get into the heart of the matter of these 13 principles, and we are going to discuss tonight the first 5. Because you're probably wondering, how are we going to get through all 13 if we're already on class number 3? We're already on class number 3 and we haven't even touched on any of them yet. The answer is because we're going to be discussing 5 tonight. Next week we're going to be discussing 4, and the week after that, 3. Why that breakdown? Anybody have an idea? Why would I break it into such an unusual chunks? That's 12? Did I do that wrong?
Yes, it is 12.
Hold on. 5 tonight.
4 next week is 9, and 3 following week is 12. No?
Okay, I need to go back to my math school. Oh, maybe it.
One in the first 5.
Well, we sort of dealt it. We sort
The
of.
first 5 are about the.
We sort of. Well, let's take a look inside. Let's see where my math is wrong. The first 5, which we're going to touch on tonight, are the knowledge of God and the nature of God. For example, and we're going to go through them. Number 1, that there is a God. Number 2, that number 2, that this God is unique in the sense that he is one. He is one. We'll see exactly what that means. Number 3, he is incorporeal. He has no body. Okay. Number 4, he is. What's number 4? Eternal. Number 5, that we can only worship God and no other. So that is all about God and the nature of God and our service of God. So those are the first 5. Then let's take a look. We have the next grouping, which is going to be next week. The prophets are true. That's number 6. Number 7, the unique prophecy of Moshe. Number 8, that the Torah that we have is the same Torah that Moses gave. Number 9, that the Torah will not be replaced by a New Testament or the Quran. Well, all right, I don't think they would say the Quran like that. That's more of in Arkansas. The Quran. or the Quran. So that is 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so that's about the Torah. Number 10, and now we get into the realm of reward and punishment. So it's actually 4 and 4. That answers our question, because 8 and 5 is 13. Is that right? Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So if you look at the last grouping, which is reward and punishment, number 10, that God knows the actions and thoughts of man, that God rewards and punishes, the coming of the Mashiach, and the resurrection of the dead, which of course are also both based on the concept of reward and punishments. So we're going to take a look. Everybody should have their Art Scroll Siddur. If you don't have one, they're in the back. We're going to turn to page 179, and we're going to be looking into these 13 principles. So again, tonight, the first 5, which deal with the principles of God and the nature of God. Next week, 4, which are prophecy, and the last week, another 4, reward and punishment. So as we mentioned in class number 1, the 13 principles are broken up into these three grouping, 179. These 3 groupings: the knowledge of who God is, the Torah, and finally reward and punishment. And that's the way these last 3 weeks are going to go. We're going to cover each of the 3 groupings. So who's ready to get into it? You ready? Whew. Stretch your arms and legs.
You just pop both elbows.
I'm very talented. Okay. Don't bring me to a chiropractor, then you get to see what I can really do. Okay. Number 1, on page 178 in your Art Scroll Siddur. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, creates and guides all creatures, and that He alone made, makes, and will make everything. He alone made, makes, and will make everything. This is the belief, the first of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, the 13 principles, that God is the primal cause of creation. Only God. He alone created the world. We're going to call this the principle of primality. God created the world alone. There was no tortoise holding up the world. Anybody seen that? Ever heard about that? Tortoise. Is that an Indian belief that there's a giant tortoise?
4 elephants.
And 4 elephants underneath the turtle? Those are strong elephants. But I guess there's 0 gravity, so it works. Okay. There's no tortoise. There's no pilim. There's no elephants. Okay. There's not many gods. This one created the sea. This one created Antarctica. He had a brain freeze. This one created amphibians. The god of the Nile. The god of the cows. That's not the way it works. There was one God who created the entire world. He is the primal and primary cause of all of creation. That is principle number 1. Now we want to answer, and what I want you to consider as we're going through all the 13 principles, is what about this principle is so important that if I didn't know it and didn't believe it, my service of God would be so deficient that it wouldn't be considered hitting the mark, and therefore I couldn't create the type of relationship that would bring me to the world to come. What do you think? Why is this so important? Okay,
Monotheism.
Monotheism. Tell me a little bit more about that idea. Why is that so important?
Well, as opposed to polytheism, where there's a god of the sun and a god of the moon and a god of the rain and a god for this and for that. That's a totally different
But
concept
I'm thinking
than
that's more 2
the belief
than
in
1.
one god.
Okay, so first of all, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. There's one God. So why is that so important? Very
Because
obvious.
If you're believing in
Yeah.
any of the quote-unquote other gods, then
Right.
that is idol worship.
Okay, well, so we're actually going to get to idol worship a little bit later. Idol worship, the idea of not worshiping others, is actually going to be a number 5. Take a look at number 5. Number 5 is, I believe, in the perfect faith, that all, to him alone is proper to pray, and it is not proper to pray to any other. So number 5 is more dealing directly with your concept of monotheism versus polytheism. You should pray to God, not to Zeus, Poseidon. Who's that fertility god? Greek mythology? Come on. You guys learned this, didn't you? Who was the one that, the love one?
Isn't that Aphrodite? Isn't that woman?
Aphrodite, is that it? Aphrodite?
That woman.
And of course that frozen princess.
Oh.
Because she is very powerful. You can't, so that's more principle number 5. Principle number 5 seems to focus more on the monotheistic element. You could also argue maybe number 1 is monotheistic, but that one is just saying, besides the fact that there's only one God, don't worship the others.
Number 2 is more monotheistic.
Right?
Number 2.
Number 2 is more monotheistic. Number 2 is about God's eternity, or God's unity. Well, we're going to see that there's a lot of overlapping elements. And you may find that certain principles are encompassed in other principles. We're going to see that a lot. And for some reason, which we'll have to discover tonight, Maimonides felt that each principle was so important to list on their own, even though sometimes they're included in other principles. Like you just said, the fact that God is the primal force means that there's only one God, so therefore you shouldn't worship others. That's number 5. And also it means that he is uniquely one, which is number 2. It means he has no body, because if you have a body, you can't be unified. Every body is made up of different components. That's number 3. So you're going to see a lot of the principles overlap, but the reason why Maimonides broke them down into 5 categories is because you need to be able to integrate the ramifications of each of these 5 principles in order to have proper service of God. So number 1, we're going to focus on the fact that God is the primal cause of creation. Let me explain to you why this is so important to our service of God. Only if God is independent and absolute can he claim absolute truth. Let me explain to you what I mean by this. If God was not the primary cause, let's say God was created by another God, which, by the way, how many of you have studied Greek mythology at all? Greek mythology is filled with that. This God begot that God, who begot that God, who raped this mortal, who is with that God. It's a God family tree. It's a family tree of gods. Very confusing.
Even before that, the Titans created.
And the Titans. Okay? Wild stuff. So imagine if God was created by another God. Let's call that God Fred. Very scary God. When I hear the name Fred, I'm always frightened. Okay? Fred creates God. Now, Fred creates God. What does that tell me about God?
That God is not the sole source of power.
God cannot be the sole source of power, cannot be the primary cause of creation. Because even if he creates the world, he's dependent on Fred. And if he's dependent on Fred, then God is not absolute and independent in the purest sense of the word. And why is that so important? Because if God is going to tell us how to act, if he's going to give us a Torah, which, by the way, Torah comes from the word lohorot, to guide, a path of life, to show us how to live. And he's going to demand of us lots of strong commandments. Circumcise your kid on the 8th day. I don't know about you, but unless I feel absolutely sure that this Torah is given by the absolute source of all power, I'm not doing a little snip on my cute little fuzzy baby. And they wouldn't be doing it throughout all generations. And if I was living in the times of the Crusades, and a crusader came to me on their way to conquer the Holy Lands and take it out of the hands of the infidels, and said, the cross or the sword. Convert to Christianity or die, which was the test of many a Jew, I would have said, give me life. Pass the shrimperoni. I don't want to die for something that I'm not sure is absolutely true. Why would I do such a thing? That's why this is so important. If God is not absolute and not the independent source of creation, then he can't claim to have the absolute truth. Do you see this? Unless God is absolute, he can't claim to be giving us the absolute truth. Why is this so important? How many of you have heard of a concept of relative or subjective ethics? How many of you have heard of that?
Subjective what?
Ethics or relative ethics. How many of you have heard of that? Raise your hand. Okay. Relative ethics means to say, and by the way, very popular amongst the youth of America, or as that New Yorker said in that movie, the Ute of America, relative ethics. There is no truth. You have your truth, I've got my truth, and we can all hold hands and chew on daisies. Okay? That is very, very popular. There is no truth. There is no truth. You've got your truth, I've got my truth. But there's a very, very big problem with relative ethics. And the big problem is you can do whatever you decide to do and then rationalize it in nice, beautiful, moral language. Let me give you an example. You have an aunt, good old Gertrude. Gertrude has terminal cancer, and she is suffering. The doctors tell her she cannot be cured with chemotherapy. They've tried everything. She's too old, she's too fragile to try more invasive methods. And she comes to our good friend, Dr. Jack. You know Dr. Jack? Kevorkian. Okay? Dr. Jack. Let's call him Fred, because it sounds very scary. No. Dr. Jack Kevorkian. And Dr. Jack Kevorkian, he says, let's put her out of her misery. Why should she not be able to die with dignity? And just press this red button, and a lethal amount of morphine or whatever he puts in there will go into your system and cause your heart to stop, and you'll die painlessly on your own terms with dignity. What's wrong with that? And by the way, let me share with you, if I was not a Torah observant Jew, I would be in favor of physician-assisted suicide. Because certainly from a rational, relativistic viewpoint, what is wrong with that? It seems like the right thing to do. And so you can do what the Torah considers outright murder. Murdering someone. Helping to let a person die. It's not in our hands. Abortion's another example. A person could decide... We're just going to touch on a few. Abortion's another example. A person can decide, I feel that women should have the right to choose. Okay, I understand that. You want to have control of your body? I get that. What about the baby? So what you can do is couch this in very moral language and say, well, it's not a life. Now, who made you the decider of what a life is? That's a good question. But again, with relative ethics, you can do almost anything. And to a certain extent, Hitler gave us an insight into this, to teach us that you can truly do anything and couch it in flowery language, as he does in Mein Kampf, and explain that he's eradicating the vermin of the world. I'm no different than the man who comes to your house with the insecticide and shows you where the cockroaches are and how to get rid of them. Okay? No difference. If Jews are the vermin of the world and destroying the world, I am the great messianic figure here to cleanse the world of the vermin. And by the way, who says he's wrong? If ethics are relative, everybody can have their own opinion. Now, we might look at Hitler and say he's the greatest, most evil person in the world. But at that time in Germany, guess who he was? The Messiah. When he came out, the angels started singing. The birds started chirping. Flowers started to bloom. The great Messiah had entered the room, and his name was Adolf Hitler. And you can truly justify anything with relative ethics. It's very interesting. My father emailed me back after listening to class number 2, where we talked about the science of God. And he said, you didn't mention the reason why I believe in God. And that's because I believe that there is morality. And I said, well, good point. We're going to touch on that tonight. And what my father's referring to is this exact point. If there is no absolute source, then there can be no absolute right and wrong. All there can be is opinions. And by the way, you can have the same country that within a short period of time can switch. Abortion can be prohibited, and then within the same century, abortion can be allowed. Right, gay marriage is a good example. Homosexuality can be considered a mental illness that is something done by degenerates and pedophiles and sexual deviants. And then within that century, we can say it's completely natural. And not only that, you can get married to someone of the same sex. Prohibition, alcohol, literally you can name it. Even within the same society. And forget that. We're just looking at a small chunk of history. Go back more than 100 years and you'll see the incredible variance of moral ideas. If you're in Rome and you see a slave, you believe that the slaves are inferior. And even the great moral thinkers of the time, Aristotle, they believe that, they're actually on a lower level slaves. They don't have the same rights as us. We can put them in a gladiatorial arena and let them fight to the death for our entertainment. These are the great moral thinkers. Now, we look at that as crazy, but you have to understand, if you were living in that time period, you would have thought the same. And if you lived in India, you would have believed in a caste system. And there would be untouchables. And there would be, if you lived in Europe, you would have peasants, and you would have aristocrats, and you'd have others in between. And so we get so caught up in the moment thinking that we finally got it right. So many people I speak to in 2016, I ask them about morality, they're like, well, we're not backwards like our parents or grandparents. We finally figured it out. And what I want to shout in their ears is that that's what every generation believes. There's no generation that believes, you know what? We just didn't get it right this generation. We're just off. We truly buy into whatever generation we're born in. We think we are not backwards and archaic like our grandparents. We finally got it. That's why an absolute place of morality, an absolute system of morality, which can only come from an absolute source. Principle number 1, that there is a primal cause, only God. He can give us a system that is absolute. And that system of absoluteness can go throughout time. And therefore you could be a Jew in the 1400s and you'll have the same moral code as a Jew in the 21st century. You will have the same moral ethics. They don't wax, they don't wane, they don't change. It's the same absolute set of ethics from one absolute God. And what my father said is, I believe in God because I believe in morality. Because you see, if there's no God, then what are we? A giant accident, a universal mistake, bits of carbon, no different from a rock. Just move a little and we play football. But not much different. Not much different at all. And therefore, morality can only come from outside of our world, telling us there's something right and something wrong. Let me show you how intuitively you all get this. And you could ask non-religious people this question, and they don't realize that their answer is a strong proclaim that there is a God. Is there a difference between killing a cow and killing a person? Is there a difference? What do you say?
Yes.
Yes.
Of course.
Well, if you're a vegan, you probably think that.
They're still taking life.
Is there a difference? What? There's a difference? Almost everybody you speak to will say, well, of course. A human's a human, and an animal's an animal. So there's no difference, you're saying? There's no difference between an animal and a human. Let me ask you a question. A person comes to you and says, I'm going to kill you. You have two choices in front of you. You have the little Wyoming toad, near extinction, and now, thank God, coming back into the world in numbers. The Wyoming toad. And now you have Jamie Duppeldorf. You don't know her. She's not part of your family. Who do you kill? Why? You're saying the toad, of course. You just said there's no difference.
Really, what I meant is you're still taking a life.
Is there a difference?
Yes, there's a difference.
Is it just because we're smarter, or is there something more than just the fact that we're smarter? If a man is not created in the image of God, there is no qualitative difference between killing a toad and killing a man. Yeah, a man's smarter. So that's a quantitative difference. It's not a qualitative difference. But intuitively, we all know that a human is different than an animal. One of the great examples of relative ethics is an organization. I check their website every week just because I find it very fascinating, and I am interested very much in animal rights, is the PETA website. How many of you have heard of PETA? People Eating Tasty Animals. You heard of them? You put shawarma right inside it. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They had a billboard that was put up in Los Angeles.
Animals.
So we're gonna show this. They put up a billboard in Los Angeles, and it had a picture of caged chickens, pollo, next to concentration camp survivors behind barbed wire. And the quote was something along the lines of, "What is the difference?" People were appalled. How can you compare the two? But to me, it made perfect sense. If there is no God, why would you see a caged chicken and not feel the same plight that you do for the Jews in the concentration camp? They're both living organisms, stuck in this terrible caged area. It's horrible. They're the same. But intuitively, we know they're not the same. And the recognition that it's not the same is because we understand that man was created in the image of God.
Don't you think that
And the Wyoming toad was not. Do I what?
Don't you think people that do not believe in God see a difference between the toad and the person?
I do not. I do not believe that if you don't believe in God, you'd have to explain to me, can anybody give me a rational explanation if you don't believe in God, why there would be a difference qualitatively between a human and an animal?
It's just your own. So the toad, if you have the toad that he picked to save the toad.
Right, it would only be, I want to help my own
So it's a
species.
human. Right, so it's like you
But
see
there's
yourself.
nothing qualitatively different. I'm carbon, he's carbon. I'm more evolved. I'm more evolved. Big whoop.
Right, but a person can make decisions that affect the world for the good. So if you had to choose between the toad and the person.
Many environmentalists and many animal rights activists, in fact, take the opposing view that not only are humans better, they are the cause of the downfall of the universe with their pollution. The animals, they just hop around to keep the world nice and good and the ecosystem's working. But the humans, we destroy the world. In some ways,
It's malicious.
in some ways, it's even worse. Yeah, Chad.
Yeah, Rabbi Yogi. I'm not trying to hijack the conversation. I just read a book by a Jewish guy, not a rabbi, but Peter Singer,
Yeah.
Australian philanthropist.
Uh-huh.
And his argument in animal liberation is that it's not, you can't say it's equal, it's hard
Right.
to say that, right? But there is a ratio. So, you first mentioned Dr. Kevorkian
Right.
and like a Rahmanis killing.
Right.
Right. Versus, say you had, 900 million animals are killed every year in America.
Right.
I think they said 200 million of those don't even go to human consumption. It's
Right.
just a true shanda that they're being killed.
Yeah.
So it's really just kind of like a ratio.
So I'm not arguing that there's no place to say we have to limit our consumption or not all killing of animals is appropriate and responsible. I'm not talking about that at all.
That's not what he's saying. He says even though you're killing either the cow or the person, you're still taking a life. Okay, you value the life of the human more, but you still value the life of the cow or dog or cat or whatever it may be. It's still you're still taking a life.
So it happens to be, you should just know about the concept of taking a life. The only reason that I think anyone has the right to eat meat is if they are religious people. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. If you are not religious and there is truly no difference between you and the animal, okay, then what right do I have to take its life? Now, if you say, well, I'm an animal, and it's an animal, it's the way of the animals to do it, okay, I can hear that. But you will find with many animal rights activists who do not believe in God, they'll say you can't eat an animal. And when you ask them, but you're an animal, they'll say, yeah, but we have the ability to think and consider, right, to not hurt the animal. Right? What do you think what do you think the response to that is? What do you think the response to that is? The only reason why deep down you can make the distinction, because scientifically you're the same, you're both mammals. The only reason that deep down you can make the distinction that I have the ability to have a free will decision and be, quote unquote, above the animals is because deep down you recognize that you are not an animal. And because you're not an animal, you can make decisions that animals wouldn't make. The lion doesn't consider when he kills the gazelle. It's because the very fact that you're not an animal that you can have the consideration not to kill animals. The very argument to say we shouldn't kill animals is the proof that you are not an animal. And therefore, if you're not an animal, we can have a separate discussion, which is, because we're not animals, do we have the right to eat an animal? Now, if you believe in the Torah says that after the great deluge, after the flood of Noah, man was allowed to consume animals, not beforehand. And therefore, religiously, you have the right to do that. Kabbalistically, when you take in an animal, you actually elevate it from an animal form where it's not able to have free will to a higher level of existence. And actually, the Kabbalists say if the animals could, they would say, thank you for consuming me. I would have been just in an animal form, and now I got turned into the image of God. But we're not here to talk about animals. I want to go back to the primary issue that we're talking about. The reason why it's so important to know that there's one God, a primal cause, is because if God was not primary, he could not claim to have absolute truth. And we wouldn't have a Torah. We would have relative ethics. You should know, we are dependent. God's not dependent, man is dependent. We're dependent on air. We're dependent on someone not killing us. We're dependent that our heart keeps beating. We're, of course, dependent on God. Deep down, we recognize as human beings that we're not truly real in the truest sense of the word. We're not fully independent and absolute like God is. We depend on so much to be alive. We can die. We have a beginning, we can have an end. So what happens is that subconsciously we recognize that we're not fully real, we're not absolute, and therefore we crave to become absolute. And so if you're Stalin, you need portraits of you put everywhere. If you're Napoleon, you need statues put everywhere. Even though they know they're going to die and they don't believe that there's a God, they don't believe in an afterlife, why would they do it? Because they want to achieve eternity. Even though they know they're going to be dead and can't see it, and it's not really eternal, but they can convince themselves, create a delusional reality that they can become real. They can become absolute. Narcissism is part of that. Narcissism is part of that. But the point is, the desire, our craving for fame and power and acceptance comes from the desire to be real and absolute. But the reality is we're not. Only God is absolute. That's principle number 1. So what we can do to create reality is we create illusions. Fame, power, money. Now we feel like we're real, even though we know it's only an illusion. You will die, and the only thing you will take to your grave is your good deeds. What's the only way to become real? There's only one way. Can anybody tell me? There's only one way you can become real.
Believe in the 15 principles.
You just added 2. Believe in the 15 principles.
You said 13.
Oh, 13. I thought you were adding a couple. I wanted to hear them. You can give the class. Believe in the 13 principles. Or in other words, if there's only one source of reality and that's God, you know how I become real? By attaching myself to that reality. If I attach myself to that reality, I become real. I have plugged in my cable cord. Everybody has one. It's out of your pupik. Okay? I have plugged in this, or you can imagine a rope. I've tied it around myself. Then I go and lasso Hashem, God, and now I'm connected to God, and I'm pulling myself up. I'm connecting to reality. I can be real now. It sounds like a song. I can be real. Okay. You can be real now. You can connect yourself to God. That's the only way to be real. What was that? A cell phone charger, exactly. Now, the reason that a lot of people get into things that distract them, whether it be drugs or movies or all sorts of different things that can distract you, is to rid ourselves of the deep feeling that we're not real. There's a deep feeling that our lives are truly not consequential. Our lives are not truly meaningful. They're not absolute. And so either you can do something about it and connect to reality, or you can fill your mind up with all sorts of other things to distract you, or you can do what we'll talk about in number 5, where you do try to connect to reality, but in a misguided way. That's called idolatry. But in order to be real, we have to connect to the real Hashem. If we fail to understand that God is absolute, it stifles our urge to worship him. Because if he's not absolute, why should I serve him? I only want to serve the source, the one. Or we can try to evade him. Like a president. A big president's got a lot of power, but you feel like you can evade him. You might be able to evade God too if you don't see a qualitative difference between God and us, just a quantitative difference. And again, Olam Haba, the world to come, an absolute reality can only come from an absolute source. So principle number 1, God is the primary source of creation. And that's so important because unless he is absolute and primary, he cannot give us the absolute truth. And the truth that we can know is absolutely the set of morals that we need to follow. And if we don't see that God's absolute, it stifles our urge to worship him. So that is why principle number 1 is so important. Any questions? Does that make sense to everybody? You have to know that God's primary and absolute to be able to want to worship him, and also in order to be able to do all of the intense commandments that he puts upon us. Commandment number 2, you ready? Principle number 2. Principle number 1 was God is absolute, primal. Principle number 2, the unity of God. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is his name, is unique. And there is no uniqueness like his in any way, and that he alone is our God, who was, who is, and who always will be. God is one. God is one. And those, by the way, are 2 of the mitzvahs. You have to know that there's a God, and you also have to know that God is One, like we said earlier, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, Hashem, our God, Hashem is one. God is one. So principle number 2, God is one. Are you one, Todd?
Am I one?
Are you one, Todd?
I guess in some ways I'm one.
Do you have split personalities?
No.
Are you one in the truest sense of the word?
In the, I'm not sure.
Let me tell you how I know that Todd, as wonderful as he is not one. Okay, Todd, do you love your arm?
Yes.
Does a lot of good things for you, right?
Yes.
Try eating sushi with that arm. It's very difficult. Dipping the fish in the soy sauce with your teeth. Very, very challenging. Okay, what would happen, God forbid, if you were in a car accident and you lost your arm? What percentage of Todd's body is his arm? Give me an idea. What percentage?
15%.
If you put it all on a scale. 15%. Is Todd now 85% Todd? So when I see Todd next after he lost his arm, do I turn to Todd and say, what's going on? 85% Todd. What's going on?
Only in the
You're a
physical
little 15% different than you were
physically.
yesterday.
Right.
But he's still the same.
He's still the same. That means to say that his arm could be over here, okay, and Todd is over here. Deep down, the reason why he is still Todd is because your soul is your real you, and that doesn't change. But I can still take off his arm. I'm not going to. I promise. And since I can take off your arm, you're not one in the truest sense. Your arm could be over there. You could have a leg over there. We could come up with a great way to dissect Todd. Okay, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. You're not one in the truest sense. You're not one. You have a birth. You have a death. You age. You change. You're not one. There's a lot of change going on. One in the truest sense of the word is forever. The same. Unchanging. You can't separate. He is one, unlike every other type of unity that exists. Now the reality is, you can't fulfill the first principle to know that God's the primary source if you don't understand the second principle that he's one. Because remember, the moment that he's not one, he's not primal. The moment that he's not one, he's not the primary source. There's other sources out there. It has to be that God's one in order to be primal. But again, Maimonides separated two so we could integrate the idea. Why is it so important to know that God's one? Why would this affect our service of God? Can't I be a good Jew and just think of God as two? We'll call one Gadi, the other one God. Hashem and another. Yeah.
I just noticed that in Hebrew it's a lot more powerful than in English, because in Hebrew it says it's Yogi,
Right.
which means one.
Right.
But unique doesn't necessarily mean one.
Right. The Hebrew is always better. Yachid is a much better word. Instead of unique, he's one. What was that?
You have a speech that you would like.
Oh, my speech? Thank you, Susan. Because if you don't know Hebrew, there's no hope for you. That is, Susan, thank you for the reminder.
Yes, I'm thrilled.
I like to remind everybody when we find not perfect, because and I'll add my second line here, because every translation is a commentary. So if you really want to get to the heart of the matter, you have to read it in the original. Okay? So God is one. Why is it so important for our service of God to know that he's one? There's a subtle influence of polytheism that creeps into even our holy monotheistic minds. And that is the desire to turn seeming, conflicting facets of God's providence into separate causes. Let me explain to you what I mean.
Like the Trinity.
You see good in the world, and you see bad. You see poverty and you see wealth. You see wind, you see fire. I see rain. Remember that song? You see all sorts of different phenomena. And so you know what happens? we can't, in our very limited minds, wrap our head around the fact that all these different facets of the world, often contradictory in our minds, good and evil, feast and famine, war and peace, we can't wrap our head around the fact that they come from one source. So what we do, psychologically, subconsciously, or sometimes not subconsciously, we ascribe them to different sources. The good comes from God. The bad, Satan! Satan! It's the devil. The devil's work, I tell you. So you have God and you have Satan. You have this demonic force out there that God can't control. He's like this chihuahua that you can't get to shut up. Right? He's a dog off his chain. He's the devil. So that's God and Satan. That's one way that you could separate the two. Now in Judaism we say the same God who does the good also is the same God responsible in the world when you see the bad. Kishem shemevarchem ala tov, mevarchem ala ra. Just as we thank God for the good, we thank God for the bad, because it's all one, unity. One God responsible for the good and the bad. And again, the bad I put in quotations, it seems to us bad. Of course, we believe everything is for the good. Hakol latov. Everything is for the good. Gamzu latova. This too is for the good. A great Talmudic sage would say at every bad occasion in his life. But that's a very hard thing for our minds to wrap around. That's why when a person dies, what is the first thing a Jew says? Baruch Dayan Emes. Blessed is the true judge. We don't say, darn that Satan took away Gertrude. We don't say that. We say, blessed is the Baruch Dayan Emes. Blessed is the true judge. Because God does the good, and God also does what seems to us as bad. The feast, the famine, the war, the peace. We have to see God in a much more mature way. That if God is one, then everything comes from God.
I don't think war is God's choice.
Why not? This is a very good example. War is not God's choice. Why?
Because, God gave us the ability to make our own decisions.
Okay, it's a good point.
It's a man-made thing.
It's a good point. It's a good point that God gives us free will. And yes, it's true. If every time man wanted to do something bad, God stopped him, you couldn't really call it free will. You're absolutely right. But at the same time, we also believe, the first commandment in the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God. How does it keep going? I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Why doesn't it say I'm the God who created the universe?
Because people still can say I was there.
So first of all, experiential. It's a God I can relate to. I was there in Egypt when he took me out. But also a different idea the commentaries tell us. We need to know that not only did God create the world, he continues to be involved in the affairs of man. He didn't just create the world and then go off to Tahiti and drink Kool-Aid with those little umbrella straws and have fun with the angels. Okay? He continued to have an involvement, an interest in the world. We call that divine providence. So it's true on the one hand, Ed, you're absolutely right. God doesn't create wars, so to speak. Men have free will to do as they choose. But you have to also understand, and it's hard for us to wrap our heads around it, and if you come to my class on free will, which I give usually once a year, we deal with the seeming contradiction of how can God give us free will and also have divine providence and know the future. Very hard to wrap our heads around it. But nevertheless, God still allows that to happen. If there was something that would get in the way of God's plans for how the world would go, he would have to stop it. Sometimes he interferes like he did in Egypt, like he does through much of history, and says, I'm going to create slight changes of events without tampering with our free will so that the world goes in the direction I need it to go. How do the two work together? It's a good question for another class. And so the answer is, you're right, and in another way, you're wrong. You are right, it's free will, but also God does have a degree of, not even a degree, God does have a direct say in the way that the world goes. Monotheistic man does this as well. If we don't see God as unified, we tend to identify God with one characteristic more than another. And you see this a lot in Christianity. Christianity will talk about that God is the loving God, the God of the New Testament. But the God of the Old Testament, he was a jealous God. You ever hear that? If you ever speak with missionaries. See, I always tell people, you should fly with me. It's a lot of fun. God has a sense of humor with Rabbi Yogi. I always on planes either sit next to a secular Jew or a missionary. Every flight. I just went to New Orleans. On the way there, a secular Jew. On the way back, a missionary. God's like, takes turns. Like, I want to keep it interesting for you, Yogi. Speak to a missionary, they talk about that. The God of the Old Testament is a jealous God, a warring God, a mighty God. And the God of the... So that's the Old Testament. The God of the New Testament is the God of love. Now that's a much more appealing kind of God. I want to be with the God of love. I don't want to be with the jealous and angry God. So we do this. Even as monotheists, we tend to attach God to one trait over another trait. But understanding that God is one means to say we have to take God in the fullness of what it means. He is at once merciful and at once vengeful. Not in the revenge kind of way, but just. He cares about justice and he cares about mercy. See, if you don't see God in his totality, what you can start to do is rationalize anything you want to do. I heard a rabbi, a quote-unquote Orthodox rabbi, recently say that he had students who would become a little bit more observant, and their homes were not kosher. Their parents' homes were not kosher. And he would tell them, if you don't eat in your parents' home, you're not a student of mine. Because you have to show respect to your parents and love for your parents. How could you become more religious and then go home and not eat in their homes? That's completely wild and crazy. Because the Torah says you can't eat non-kosher. It also says you have to honor your parents. You've got to find a way to do both. Not eat non-kosher and also find a way to honor them. It's tricky, but it can be done. But how could this rabbi, who I think was very misguided, suggest this? Because he had prescribed to God the characteristic of mercy and love much more than the characteristic of justice and rigid law.
And it says it right in the verse of honor your parents.
Right. And in fact, very good. In fact, in the very verse in the Torah where it talks about honoring your parents, commandment number, which commandment? Commandment number 5, just remember it. You can think about the patch, 5 fingers, honor your parents. And then commandment number 5. Commandment number 4, 2 candlesticks, 2 challahs. Commandment number 4, keep the Sabbath. Why does it say keep the Sabbath before honor your parents? To teach you, says the Talmud, that if your parents tell you to break the Sabbath, you don't have to listen. Sabbath comes first because your parents and you are both obligated to honor me, God. And so the verse understands this inherent contradiction. I want to honor my parents, and I also want to keep the mitzvahs. What if my parents tell me not to keep the mitzvahs? What has precedence? The answer is, you and your parents are obligated to honor me. Therefore, the divine commandment, the mitzvah of Shabbos, that your parents are also obligated in, whether they do it or not is a different story, but they're also obligated in it. That takes precedence over honoring them. So you've got to find a way to honor them. And you've got to find a way to keep kosher. And you've got to find a way to keep the Sabbath. But you can't suddenly say, in order to honor my parents, I'm just going to eat the non-kosher to make them feel comfortable. That's called, you can rationalize any sin the moment you don't see God in his totality. And you lift the characteristic of love and mercy above the characteristic of strict justice. We have to be able to have both together equally strong. And we don't know. We have to do our best to do both. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, this is the difference between Christianity and Judaism. I've heard more the theory that we regard, the Jews regard God as rigid and more in terms of justice, and then the Christians regard God as more merciful and loving. Not necessarily the Old Testament.
Well, that's what they mean, though. That's what they mean.
But it's how we perceive it versus how
Okay.
we perceive it.
The reality is Jews see God as both merciful and also with rigid expectations for us. Christianity is more focused just on the characteristic of love. And the problem is, it allows for all sorts of terrible things. When all you have is love, you can rationalize almost anything. So you have to see God in his totality. And finally, the other reason I want to share with you an incredible line from the sages of the Talmud. The Talmud says that Noah, from the flood of Noah, you remember him? Remember Noah? Noach mimechusrei amana haisa. Noach was deficient in his faith, says the Talmud. What does that mean? How could Noach be deficient in his faith? Noah built the ark all those years while everybody else laughed at him, scoffed at him. Noach was saved because he found mercy in God's eyes. And of course, Noach was a prophet of God. He heard God speak. So what does it mean that he was lacking in his faith? So when you hear an incredible explanation, it's the same thing. It's the polytheistic, the subtle influences of polytheism. Because Noach thought deep down that God's quality of mercy would overcome his quality of strict justice. And although he believed that God could do the flood, he didn't think God would do the flood.
How do we know?
And we fall, let's keep that for Parshas Noach, how the rabbis of the Talmud knew that. But I'm just using that as this example that as monotheists, we do this too. And we rationalize all sorts of sins because, well, God, of course, is a loving God. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to make other people feel comfortable. And then suddenly anything and everything is allowed. Or the opposite. God is a strict God. So I'm just going to be super strict and not worry about the effect and ramifications it has on other people. What about the mercy? You have to find a way of seeing the totality of God. And that comes by seeing God as one. Does everybody understand this? And that's why service of God is so important, to see God as one, so that we understand God in his fullness. He is at one, merciful and just. We're not going to bribe God in one way. We're not going to rationalize sins because we think one characteristic of God is more important than another. Let's take a look at principle number 3. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is he, is not physical and is not affected by physical phenomena, and that there is no comparison whatsoever to him. God's incorporeality, as it says in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, Lo re'isem kol temuna. You did not see an image when you saw God on the mountain. You didn't see an image. God has no body. I don't mean no body like he's sad. He has no body. Okay, I just want to make that clear. He ain't got a body. He has no physicality. Why does it say in the Torah all sorts of physical descriptions?
So that we can relate.
The eyes of God are upon you. God took us out with an outstretched arm. Why does it refer to it? So the Rambam, Maimonides, says the Torah speaks in the language of man. It's trying to give us language that we can understand who God is. If it says the eyes of God are upon us, it means he's always watching over us. Does God have physical eyes? Are they blue? Are they brown? Are they hazel, perhaps? No, he has no physical eyes. Why is this so important? Why is this so important in our service of God, to know that God has no body?
So no one will claim that they saw.
Like a body with limited, right?
And it would not last.
What's that? Say it again. What's the reason why it's important to know he has no body?
It would limit him because he wouldn't live forever.
Okay, if he were physical, he would be limited. Very good. He would have boundaries. You can't be in two places at once if you have a body. Man could elude him as well. If you want to serve God in the proper way, you cannot elude God. You have to know that God sees you wherever you are, and we're going to talk about that more with reward and punishment. And if you can elude God, God has no power to tell you how to behave and how to live. I'll just hide in this little mountain. It's almost like, reminds me of like the Greek gods, like, I'll get away from Poseidon, I'll go on land. Or you know what? The Jewish God, you know where I'm going to go? Whataburger. God never steps into Whataburger, that treif joint. He's never going to go there. So I'll go and evade God. So God not having a body is so important for us to know, because otherwise God is a limited God. He's not the kind of God that we want to serve. Let's take a look at number 4. Let's take a look at number 4. Principle number 4, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is his name, is the very first and the very last. God is eternal. In fact, the name of God, Yod He Vav He Haya, Hoveh, Yeh, he was, he is, he will be. He always will be. God is eternal. Do you know, the verse that Maimonides quotes when he talks about God's being eternal is a verse in Deuteronomy, Me'onah Elokei Kedem. Me'onah Elokei Kedem means the eternal God is a dwelling place. Or more appropriately, it means the God that preceded all existence. The God that preceded all existence, he is our dwelling place. That means to say that God preceded matter. God existed before matter. God existed before the universe. God existed certainly before our world. In the beautiful words, God created the world. How do you say it in Latin? Ex nihilo. He created the world from nothing. I want to share with you an incredible insight why that's so important, to know that God created the world from nothing. Right? And by the way, we spoke a little bit about last week in science. Big Bang Theory suggests this idea that the world had a beginning. Why is it so important to know that the world was created from nothing? Do you know that Aristotle actually believed that the world existed forever? Not necessarily the world, but that matter existed forever. Did you know that he believed that? He actually believed that both God and matter existed eternally. And it wasn't a contradiction in his mind to see that there could be a God who's a creator of the world, and that the matter which is the world is comprised of both existed forever. God and and matter. God is a creator, so therefore eventually he uses the matter like Play-Doh, like my little Hilo. He'll take some Play-Doh together and he'll make a nice little puppy. Let's call the puppy Fred. Okay? So God does that. God's a creator. So eventually, of course, he takes the matter which has existed forever along with God, and he makes it nice and round. He puts a little blue over here, a little green, some fauna, some flora. Bada bing, bada boom, pop it in the microwave, and out comes the Earth and the universe and Jupiter and Mars and our little planet that used to be a planet, Pluto. Poor Pluto. I always felt bad for Pluto. So that's what he does. That's what he does. So Aristotle believed that the world, matter, and God existed concurrently, together, eternally. Wasn't a contradiction. In Judaism's understanding, what the Torah says, there was nothing but God originally. And then God said, I'm going to create a world. So you have to understand, if God and matter existed forever, God is a very limited God again. The matter is around as long as he is. God is just this machine that has to create. So eventually he takes the matter that's around him and puts stuff together.
And then you have to ask who created the matter.
There's
That's
no
an area.
Right. Well. No. He didn't believe there was a beginning. Aristotle felt that they both existed eternally. There was no starting point. Can you really call God a God if something else always existed along with him? It creates a very small, docile, mechanistic type of God. He's a creator, so eventually he's got to create. You can't ask the question to Aristotle, why did God create the world? He's a creator in his essence, and there's matter around, so he's just got to do it occasionally. But according to the Jewish understanding in the Torah, There was no world. There was no matter. So if God decides to create a world, why is he doing it? For a reason. Because there was no matter. If he decided let there be matter, guess what that means? He had a will for the world. And if he had a will for the world, he has a will for us. He has a will for us to do something in this world. And the world has meaning and purpose. There's a why. You can't ask Aristotle's God, why did you create it? It just is. I am a creator, and eventually I got to create, and there's matter all around me, so I'm going to take it and make Play-Doh. But if I create the matter, it's because I willed the world into existence. There's a purpose for the world. There's a meaning to the world. That's called what we said, Torah and mitzvahs. But if you don't understand that God preceded existence, then you can't relate to God, because he's not the God in the way we see him. And the world has no purpose and mission. And so this fourth idea, to not see the world through Aristotle's lenses, that the world and matter always existed. No, God created matter, which means there is now a purpose. If God willed a world into being, then it's for a reason. He doesn't will a world into being for no reason. But if matter always existed and God just puts it together, because that's what he does, there is no why. Matter exists, God exists, occasionally does stuff with it. That's just what he is. And so that is principle number 4. And finally, let's take a look at principle number 5. This is the last of the principles about God and the nature of God. Ani mamin b'emuna shlema. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is his name, to him alone is it proper to pray, and it is not proper to pray to any other. We can't do idolatry. And here, it's important to know the difference between wielding power versus being the source of power. They may have started Marv. I don't know. Just to let you know. I don't know. We have to look at the difference between wielding power and the source of power. Let me give you an example of this. How many of you are familiar with military life? Joe? Sabrina, were you in the military? Israeli military. Very impressive.
Sergeant.
And a sergeant. We are going to use Sabrina as our example. What was your Hebrew name? Or what is your Hebrew name?
I don't have a Hebrew name. It's Sabrina Mosey.
Sabrina's Hebrew name is Sabrina. Okay? Can everybody say that? Sabrina. You have to roll the resh. Can't say Sabrina. You have to say Sabrina. Sabra. She's a Sabra. Sabrina. Okay. Sabrina's a sergeant. Now, as a sergeant, do you wield power or are you the source of power? You wield power. You have some power. If one of your cadets, I don't know what they call them, little Tsahalniks, okay, Shloimi and Arik or whatever, whatever the names are, Dror, Tommy, Dudi, Fred. One of your little Tsahalniks, if he needs a weekend pass to go home to Beer Sheva to go eat falafel with his friend Schnitzy, so you are the one they're going to turn to. They're going to ask you for that weekend pass. But the reality is the source of power is the commander-in-chief. That's in Anglo lingo. And he in Israel, the one who wields power, whoever the commander-in-chief there is, I don't know, is it the Rosh the Ramatkal? Whoever is the head of the army, he's the one who actually is the source of power. So you can have on one hand you have the commander-in-chief, they actually are the source of power.
Well, in between there's like maybe
a lot of levels.
100 different sources.
But that's okay. The one on top is the one who is really the source of power. Because that person makes the big decisions.
He's also bound to...
Okay, if he's bound to somebody else, then maybe he's not the ultimate source of power. But let's just use this as an example. Okay. He's bound to the Knesset, who has to make their decisions. But in the end of the day, the one who's the head of the army, they are the source of power. They decide, are we going to war or not? Then they put all the underlings underneath them into action, and they go according to the source of power's decision. Now, along the chain of command, each person wields a certain degree of power. And as a sergeant, you had the power to send Fred home to eat some falafel on the weekend. Maybe you had that?
Not really, but
Not really? Okay. You didn't even have that much power?
no, I was just promoted as just because of the length of time that I was a soldier.
Could you at least get them,
I did
like,
not have any- I was
meat
a
once in a while?
worker type person.
Okay, all right.
I didn't have any,
But you understand the idea.
Yes.
There's a difference between the one who is the source of power versus the one who is the wielder of power, the one who wields power. So a soldier who needs a weekend pass, all they care about is the one who wields power. I don't really care about the Ramat Kal. I just need a weekend pass. So they're going to turn to you. Let's put this in spiritual language. God is the one who is the source of power. But he allows there to be all sorts, a whole spiritual hierarchy of other things that also wield power. He creates constellations, which wield power. He creates malachim, angels, which wield power. He creates humans, which wield a certain degree of power. Idolatry is turning to the one who wields power versus turning to the one who is the source.